Welcome. Welcome to this roundtable on sustainable finance. So I'd like to discuss with my panelists the challenges in the transition towards a carbon neutral world. I'm very pleased to introduce now the three panelists of today. We have Dr. Barbara Buchner. She is a Global Managing Director of Climate Policy Initiative and also the Executive Director of its widely renowned Climate Finance Program. Named one of the 20 most influential women in climate change, Barbara advises leaders on climate, energy, and land use investments around the world. Barbara directs the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance, known as the Lab. The Lab's public-private approach solicits, shapes, and tests cutting-edge climate finance instruments that resolve financing barriers hindering alternative energy, adaptation, and land use projects. Instruments from the lab have mobilized over $2 billion for sustainable development over 5 years. She's also the lead author on CPI's Global Landscape of Climate Finance, which set the benchmark for climate finance tracking. She's on the advisory board of the BCFN Foundation, the evaluation board of the World Economic Forum's Sustainable Energy Innovation Fund, and a member of the One Planet Lab. The second panelist of today is Mireille Chiroleu Assouline. She is professor in economics at the Paris School of Economics and the Université Paris 1 Panthéon-Sorbonne. Her research topics are focused on environmental economics. In particular, she analyzes the possibility of environmental tax reforms that avoid increasing inequalities. Beyond command and control and carbon pricing policies, she's interested in voluntary approaches such as corporate social and environmental responsibility, the implementation of eco-labels, and green finance. And I would also like to welcome Philippe Zaouati. He is Managing Director of Mirova, an asset management company specializing in sustainable investment. After a successful career in various financial institutions, including Caisse de dépôt and Crédit Agricole, he has devoted himself for 10 years to the development of responsible investment. He is author of several books, including Green Finance Begins in Paris and Sustainable Finance, Ringing in a Second Chance. But he's also author of several novels. Involved in public debate, Philippe Zaouati contributed to writing of Emmanuel Macron's presidential program on the environment. He is co-founder and president of the think tank Osons le Progrès, which aims to be a laboratory of progressive ideas. Philippe Zaouati also teaches sustainable finance at Sciences Po. So I'd like to welcome everyone. And I would like to start out with the first topic, which is around data availability, if we actually want to progress with sustainable finance and addressing climate change. So the Paris Agreement actually recognizes the importance of the financial sector in the transition to a carbon neutral world. More specifically, Article 2C of the Paris Agreement states explicitly that one of the goals is making finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. However, we know that successful strategies, we also need to have the proper data. And that's a major issue. I just give you one example for ESG data. So there's been a recent study by the MIT. They showed that on average, 6 data providers for ESG data, if you look at the correlation between those ESG ratings, they're actually relatively low. And this problem is, of course, true for the whole sector of sustainable finance. So I'd like to address the first question to Barbara. The Climate Policy Initiative plays an important role in improving data collection and standardizing reporting worldwide. So how did actually data availability on climate investment change in the past few years, and where are we now?
Great. Well, thank you so much, Iwan, and it's a real pleasure being here with you today and engaging in this discussion here. Yes, my organization, Climate Policy Initiative, we have since 2012 actually provided the most comprehensive assessment of annual investments to address climate change, looking at the overall scale of financial flows, but also at the key actors behind the instruments that are being used and also where the money ultimately ends up, both in terms of recipients, but also in terms of low carbon, climate resilient technologies and sectors. And our figures bring a little different perspective from the ESG discussion, which I think would be a nice complementary contribution here. But we really look at the overall finance flows. We look at primary sector, really money changing hands, and not yet the secondary transaction, which obviously institutional investors are very engaged with. But we look at these overall finance flows in order to provide a measure of progress towards estimates of total investment needed to limit the global temperature rise to below 1.5 degrees Celsius. So again, going really understanding how we're doing compared with the Paris Agreement goals. The data collection, since we started tracking in actually 2011 for the first time, has improved. It's particularly improved in the energy sector. I'm thinking of data sets such as Bloomberg New Energy Finance that now provide a really comprehensive and reliable overview of renewable energy commitments. And we've also seen progress on sustainable transport investment, both on electric vehicle sales, but also on data on charging points. Again, the International Energy Agency has been making a lot of progress there. But we also have better information on the use of proceeds from green bonds issuances, given some work we're doing with the Climate Bonds Initiative. So I think just in a nutshell, we have improved coverage, both of actors and sectors over the last years, but there's still work to be done in tracking climate finance. And in fact, we still see major data gaps that hinder our analysis and an exactly quantifiable measure of progress. And these gaps include domestic government expenditures on climate finance. There include private investments beyond renewable energy. So we have gaps in private investment in energy efficiency, in transport, land use, and adaptation. And where I think Hope will be talking about the need for better information, the need for better disclosure that certainly comes from this overall picture. There's lots of efforts to fill these gaps are taking place, and lots of networks and engagements that are being convened by different organizations, including mine. And I very much hope that this discussion today can actually help us go towards a more comprehensive understanding of the climate finance landscape. So let me hand back to you, Iwan.
Thank you. So on a more general level, I talked about the ESG ratings, and Mireille, as actually one of her research areas, is to look at eco-labels. So if you have data on ESG factors, then actually the next question is, are eco-labels actually an efficient way to foster sustainable investment? Or worded otherwise, do actually the investors select based on these scores? So I'd like to address this question to Mireille.
Merci beaucoup, Iwan, pour cette question. Merci de m'avoir invité dans cette table ronde. Je suis ravie de participer à cette discussion. L'efficacité des écolabels fondés sur des critères ESG, pour l'analyser, il faut se poser plusieurs questions. Tout d'abord, ce qu'on constate, c'est que effectivement, le volume des actifs gérés sous label ISG ou sous appellation ESG est en croissance exponentielle. Le principal intérêt des notations et des labels ESG, c'est de fournir de l'information. Les labels, comme tous les écolabels, sont supposés fournir une information fiable qui permette aux investisseurs de prendre des décisions pertinentes, étant donné leurs objectifs, en réduisant la symétrie d'information. La symétrie d'information est inhérente aux marchés financiers et les autorités des marchés financiers ont toujours pour objectif de s'efforcer de pousser les entreprises et les émetteurs d'actifs à être le plus transparent possible. C'est à ceci que contribuent les labels et les notations. Mais la question qui se pose ensuite, c'est les labels sont-ils véritablement efficaces pour réduire cette asymétrie d'information? Et il y a d'ailleurs une autre question qui est quels sont vraiment les objectifs des investisseurs? Parce que ces labels ne peuvent avoir d'effet sur les investisseurs qu'en fonction de la stratégie de ceux-ci. Alors, en ce qui concerne la contribution des labels, Dans le domaine de la finance responsable, comme dans le domaine en général de la soutenabilité et de tous les écolabels, on assiste à une floraison de labels, une multiplicité de labels, qu'ils soient privés ou nationaux. Et comme pour les notations d'agences d'ailleurs, les différences entre ces labels tiennent à des divergences d'approche, des divergences d'envergure, mais qui sont difficilement identifiables pour des non-spécialistes. Et je pense aussi pour un certain nombre d'acteurs chez les investisseurs. Donc ça crée un risque de confusion. Et ce risque de confusion justifie qu'on s'intéresse particulièrement aux initiatives d'unification et en particulier au futur label, s'il arrive à maturité, qui pourrait résulter de la taxonomie financière élaborée au niveau européen. En tout cas, dans l'état actuel, je suis d'avis que les labels et les notations tracent surtout une frontière qui est quand même encore assez mouvante entre les investissements soutenables et les autres. Je ne suis pas sûre qu'ils aient un pouvoir nettement plus discriminant. Leur principal intérêt, c'est sans doute davantage que leur obtention elle-même est vue par les entreprises ou par les émetteurs d'actifs comme un avantage sur le marché, leur permettant de réduire leur coût du capital. Et c'est du coup en poussant les entreprises à rechercher ce label et à agir de façon à pouvoir l'obtenir que ces labels ont une certaine efficacité. Maintenant, ces labels ne peuvent avoir une efficacité que si les investisseurs veulent véritablement soutenir des entreprises responsables. Et donc, cette motivation est-elle vraiment un souhait d'orientation de leurs investissements ? Est-ce que c'est un souci de rentabilité ? Est-ce que c'est un souci de diversification des portefeuilles ? C'est un peu tout ça. Et de toute façon, dans tous les cas, les labels fournissent au moins de l'information, même si elle est encore un peu brouillée.
Merci beaucoup. I would like to address the next question to Philippe, and that's directly addressing the financial sector. So I cited this study that showed that the correlation between ESG measures is actually relatively low. So my question for you would be, how does actually the industry address this challenge that the landscape of ESG scores is such that these different ESG ratings are quite different?
Thank you very, very much for inviting me. Yes, there are a lot of data available, a lot today. So we lack of pertinent data, of accurate data, but there is a lot of data. And as you mentioned, sometimes there is a low correlation between the ESG view from one rating agency to another rating agency. But it's also because they are not looking at ESG the same way. They when you say ESG, you have not say all the stories. You can use ESG for a different set of reasons. You can use ESG, for example, because you think that some of the ESG criteria are financially material. But because you think that it will give you an information about the stock price in the future. Or you can use ESG because you think that you should really integrate environmental and social into your decision-making processes because you think finance should have a role in the general interest or should be aligned with the general interest. And it's very different. And this explains some of the discrepancies that you mentioned. Some of the rating agencies, especially some of the American ones, are very biased into the financially material ESG. Some others, mostly some European, there are not a lot of European one today, but were much more focused on the impact side of the ESG. So we have a lot of very different possibilities to really integrate these ESG criteria. So what I would like to say is that creating strong methodologies and creating very accurate data is key. I agree with this. At Mirova, for example, we have been working a lot on measuring the carbon footprint of our portfolios. Since the Montreal Protocol, 6 years ago, the Montreal Pledge 6 years ago, we have decided to measure the carbon footprint of the portfolio, and we have been working a lot with a consultant, a French consultant called Carbon4, to create our own methodology to measure carbon footprint, with the objective to integrate not only Scope 1 and Scope 2, which was what everybody was using at that time, but to integrate also Scope 3 and also what we call avoided emission in the future. That means to understand exactly what are the products and services which are given by the company and how it could help to solve the problem in the future in terms of energy efficiency and so on. We have been working this year on the impact on biodiversity. How can we measure the impact on companies on nature and biodiversity? We launched an RFP with other investment managers, BNP, AXA, Sycomore, in order to create a database of the impacts of companies on biodiversity. So I fully agree that it is really something key to have this data. But I would like also to say that it has always been also an argument for not doing anything and not acting. In the last 10 years, I've listened to this, plenty of times. A lot of people saying, we do not have the accurate data, so we cannot do anything. This is absolutely wrong. We can act, and we have enough data to act. And we know what it is to do sustainable finance today, to allocate much more money in renewable energy than in fossil energy, to really allocate much more money in innovative solutions, solution providers, and so on and so forth. So there is also this, debate, which could be also a kind of chicken and egg problem. Should we need to wait for the data before acting? Can we act with the existing data, which is not really accurate? That's a very long debate that we could continue.
Thank you very much, Philippe. So my next question I would like to address is, like recent surveys have shown that investor demand for ESG products, sustainable finance products is increasing. And actually also institutional investors, they acknowledge that it's one of their main goals going forward because of investor demand. So there seems to be an increasing demand for ESG products in general and sustainable finance. But a little bit in a larger context, what would you think, Barbara? Like, how would you describe the landscape? Where are we now with regards to sustainable and probably also unsustainable investments by institutional investors and asset managers?
Great. Thanks so much, and apologies. I know I had some technical issues. I hope I'll be coming through without problems now. And just also to follow up from what Philippe just said, I think certainly we shouldn't use the data gaps as an excuse to not do something. But I do think it is important to have a good overview of where we stand in order to understand whether we're going in the right direction. In fact, for that reason, we have been TPI given now since 2012 publishing this global landscape of climate finance. And our latest report, which we published last year, shows that annual track global climate finance in 2017 and 2018 crossed the $500 billion mark for the first time. And it flows, again, of global public and private investments rose to almost $580 billion on average over the 2-year period in 2017, 2018. And that's a 25% increase from the previous 2 years. And this rise reflects a steady increase in financing across nearly all types of investors. And that obviously is a good news. I think just in terms of who is providing the finance, we see that the public sector remains basically the engine behind the climate finance architecture. But since years, it's the private sector that continues to provide the largest share. It's now at 56% of overall global finance is coming from private investors. And the corporations actually account for the majority of private investment that we can track. But commercial financial institutions are also starting to play a more important role and been increasing financing. But again, looking more at the topic of this discussion here at institutional investors, we have seen that in 2017 and 2018, well, still small in absolute terms. And again, this is because we are tracking primary transactions. Climate finance from institutional investors and funds more than tripled from the 2015-2016 figures. Again, there are now around $9 billion again of the data that we can track, and they flowed mostly to renewable energy generation, indicating that renewables markets really are increasingly perceived as more mature and less risky. And so I think that is good news. But I do want to come back to the other point you made. I think increasing climate finance commitments alone is not enough. More crucial than ever to phase out investment in fossil fuel, investments in the fossil fuel supply chain and other harmful activities, because continued financing for these activities increase the risk of missing not only the goals and of the Paris Agreement, of sustainable development goals. There's also magnifying financial transition risk related to stranded assets, and contrast really starkly with the goals that are set by the international community. And we've just published a series of papers actually where we look for the first time into the alignment of new power sector investment with Paris Agreement mitigation goals. And we find that while renewable energy investment continues to grow, that the global power sector investment is currently putting the world on a trajectory for more than double the 1.5 degrees Celsius target in the Paris Agreement. And that's due to a combination of continued new fossil fuel investments and the existing locked-in dirty fossil generation. And we really feel that there is a need to kind of foster a shift very quickly. We see that there is no country, no major investor category that's fully aligned with this overall goal of moving towards a net zero or carbon neutral future at the moment. But I do want to stress, and I'll end on this, that institutional investors with 43% of their direct investments are actually aligned with the regional targets. And that's actually the best investor group, apart from multilateral development banks, who are also a little bit marginally more on their investment portfolios as compared to these other investor types. All the others are not even exceeding 20% when assessing alignment of finance aggregated by region with the overall Paris goals trajectory. So again, I think there is a real need to focus both on doing more of the good, and we know again what can be done, but also in ensuring that less of the fossil fuel investments, less of the high carbon asset investments are being done. And let me pass back to you. Thank you.
Thank you. So I will get back to Philippe, actually asking, so in the past few years, what trends have you seen, like in mutual funds and pension plans? How do they actually restructure their portfolios? And one of my questions is also, how do they actually do it? Even if they move towards greener investments, do they divest completely from some sectors, or would they just shift their allocations to greener solutions within the same industry? So what are the trends? And also, like, are there differences worldwide among these trends?
Yes, of course, there are different things which are happening today. As Barbara said, I think clearly there is a trend for more investment in green assets. That's for sure, and we have participated to this in creating new products. I mean, green bonds and all the investment funds which are targeted to green assets. And the fact that now we have the European taxonomy is also helping to show the path and to clearly increase and strengthen the investment into these green assets. And probably Ecolabel will help to do so also in the future. Then clearly, I think that it's clearly not enough. I mean, if you look at the European taxonomy today, it's only the greenest part of the investments. It's really small. When we look, for example, at our fund, which is dedicated to the environment, our environmental European fund, and if you compare it to the European taxonomy, only 35% of the underlying assets and underlying products are in line with the European taxonomy. So that means that even when for the very engaged product, we are far from being 100% aligned with the European taxonomy. So that means that we need to broaden a little bit the space and not only to invest in the greenest part, but also to make all the rest of the economy move into the right direction. I also fully agree with Barbara that we also need to divest from some of the more carbon-intensive investments and industries. That for sure. Doing only the greenest part is not possible, but not divesting from the very carbon-intensive would clearly, lead us in the wrong direction. And the problem today is that when you mention pension funds and big investors, the big problem of this today is that the major part of these assets are still managed passively and indexed to traditional indices. That's one of the big issues, because doing so, they continue to copy-paste the world as it is today. They continue to copy-paste a world where the carbon-intensive companies still represent a very strong part of the traditional indices. So this is something that we have to change. I'm not against the passive management, but I think we should at least change the benchmarks and the indices we are tracking. So there is also something very interesting in the new European legislation about this, with the new Paris aligned benchmarks. So I think this is something very important, that all the big pension funds look at this and change the way they are indexing their big portfolios.
Very interesting. Thank you. And you said we should move in the right direction. And I have a question for Mireille on this. So on a larger scale, is it actually enough that we just rely on investors, or do we should we rely on them to move towards low carbon firms, or do we what actually does economic theory tell us, or empirical work? What do we know? Is it enough to just think that investors would move volontarily to low carbon firms?
Je crois que l'élément clé, l'élément de base, c'est que les investisseurs, comme vous le savez, prennent leurs décisions surtout sur la base d'un arbitrage entre rendement et risque. Et cet arbitrage n'est d'ailleurs pas le même selon tous les investisseurs. Par exemple, comparé à d'autres acteurs, les institutionnels, comme les compagnies d'assurance, ont une perspective de long terme qui est plus compatible avec le financement d'activités durables et donc avec le financement d'activités bas carbone. Mais pour pouvoir se reposer sur le comportement des investisseurs, il faudrait que les actifs ESG, donc les actifs vertueux, aient une meilleure performance que les autres. Et ça, c'est une question qui est très débattue d'un point de vue théorique comme empirique. Vous savez que d'un point de vue théorique, les héritiers les plus fidèles de Friedman pensent qu'une entreprise responsable est une entreprise forcément moins rentable que les autres parce qu'elle s'impose des contraintes supplémentaires. Ce qui est évidemment le cas pour une entreprise qui s'impose à un moment donné d'adopter des technologies bas carbone quand celles-ci sont plus chères pour l'instant que les technologies traditionnelles. Alors présenté comme ça, l'argument évidemment fait mouche. Il ignore pourtant tous les gains qui peuvent être réalisés par une entreprise poussée par la prise de conscience à la fois de l'importance des risques et par sa motivation pour analyser ses propres inefficacités internes. Et il est possible aussi que des entreprises gagnent en part de marché ou en compétitivité grâce à leur innovation. C'est plus ou moins l'hypothèse de Porter. Alors, sur le plan empirique, sur cette performance des actifs plus vertueux, plus verts, les études existantes sont loin d'être unanimes. La raison essentielle, c'est ce dont on parlait précédemment, c'est-à-dire c'est l'imperfection des indicateurs et le fait que jusqu'à présent, il y a une multitude d'études qui ont pu être faites, mais avec des indicateurs différents, et suivant les indicateurs utilisés, on trouve des résultats différents. Et donc, il n'est pas très clair que les actifs verts soient plus rentables. En revanche, la question qui peut se poser, c'est est-ce qu'ils sont moins risqués que les autres ? Théoriquement, ce devrait être le cas, mais pour différentes raisons selon les situations, puisque la notion de responsabilité recouvre des attitudes très différentes. On peut avoir des entreprises bien notées parce qu'elles prennent des mesures pour prévenir les risques que leur propre activité provoque. Donc, dans le cas qui nous intéresse, elles peuvent s'efforcer de prévenir les risques qu'elles font courir à la société par leurs émissions de carbone, ou simplement parce qu'elles tiennent compte du risque climatique sur leur activité. C'est-à-dire, l'un, c'est plus une prise en compte et une attitude d'adaptation finalement au risque climatique. Et donc ça, c'est quand même très, très différent. Alors, dans tous les cas, il y a une gestion des risques qui fait que ces actifs sont quand même plutôt moins risqués. Et plusieurs études empiriques récentes, dont certaines publiées là juste en novembre, ont montré que les actions des entreprises les plus responsables ont été plus résilientes que les autres au choc provoqué par les premiers mois de pandémie. Mais pour revenir finalement à la question de savoir si cela suffit de s'en remettre aux investisseurs, cela suffirait si les investisseurs étaient motivés forcément par l'aspect vert de leurs investissements. La question qui reste ouverte quand même quand on envisage de désinvestir des activités bas carbone, c'est la question qui a été remise à l'ordre du jour par Hart et Zingales récemment, consistant à dire que si l'on désinvestit de ces secteurs, cela provoque une baisse du cours des actions des entreprises concernées. C'est ce qu'on voit actuellement pour des compagnies pétrolières et qu'on peut avoir des investisseurs moins vertueux qui se précipitent sur la bonne affaire et qui, du coup, contribuent à refinancer ces activités-là. Et donc, la solution, c'est d'englober la finance durable dans une action générale, mais c'est surtout de faire qu'il y ait de plus en plus d'investisseurs vertueux et de moins en moins d'investisseurs cyniques qui se jetteraient sur ces bonnes affaires.
Mireille. And that leads us to the next question, which is actually how should institutional investors, how should they actually react in order to accelerate this transition towards a low-carbon economy? So I'll ask first, Philippe, you mentioned already that one way might be to have passive investment with a different benchmark. So what are kind of the new products that you see in the future in sustainable finance, and what do you think are the main challenges that the financial sector is facing?
I think that what will be very interesting or important will be to give much more power to the savers, to the beneficiaries of the pension funds and to the savers. If you look at the situation today, you have big institutional investors which have decided to call themselves asset owners, and I am always surprised with this wording, asset owner, because they do not own anything. The head of a pension fund is not the owner of anything. The head of an insurance company, not that much. They are just managing money for the behalf of people or citizens, for the behalf of beneficiaries or savers. And we do not ask a lot to these people what they want to do with their money. And I think this is something that should change. There is one example for the savers, and one very interesting move in Europe, which is the evolution of the MIF directive. This is the directive which regulate the distribution of financial products, and it will be probably in the coming 2 years. It will be compulsory for all the financial advisors to ask the savers about their environmental and social preferences. So this is something they don't do today. And just starting this discussion, understanding what they want to do, I think could change a lot. And I hope there will be also a regulation with the same kind of requirement for pension funds. Because when you see the last regulation in the US, the Department of Labor regulation about ESG, it doesn't take into account at all what the beneficiaries really want. If you ask beneficiaries of a pension fund, what do you want? What do you want your money that you will benefit in 30 years to be invested in oil companies? I'm not sure there will be they will agree about this. So I think this is one very important evolution for the future.
Thank you. And Mireille, you're studying also government interventions. So are actually carbon taxes, carbon trading, emissions, are these kind of ways to go, optimal ways to go to reduce carbon emissions?
Une fois de plus, la réponse théorique est oui, oui, mais on sait bien que les instruments économiques comme la taxation ou la mise en place de marchés de permis sont a priori les instruments les plus efficaces si l'on est dans des conditions idéales de marché et surtout d'information parfaite. Mais dès l'instant où l'information est imparfaite, l'endroit où placer le curseur est évidemment crucial. C'est très difficile de savoir où le placer, que ce soit pour fixer le niveau approprié de taxes ou pour fixer le montant de quotas à allouer. Et même dans le cas du changement climatique, on ne sait pas évaluer avec précision le coût social du carbone et donc le prix à imposer. Mais même dans ce cas, ces instruments sont toujours préférables aux politiques, par exemple, de command and control, comme les normes en termes de taux d'émission, par exemple, simplement en vertu des incitations à l'innovation que ces instruments exercent. Un pollueur sera toujours davantage poussé à innover ou à adopter des technologies moins polluantes si cela lui permet de réduire le poids de la fiscalité qui pèse sur lui ou la charge du coût d'achat des permis. Donc, ces instruments sont efficaces. D'ailleurs, des entreprises de plus en plus nombreuses mettent en place des prix internes du carbone. C'est bien le signe qu'elles reconnaissent le pouvoir incitatif des mécanismes de tarification du carbone. Mais elles critiquent aussi leur mise en œuvre dès l'instant où celle-ci est unilatérale en raison des effets sur la compétitivité. Et les effets sur la compétitivité sont ceux qui ont été mis en avant les premiers par justement les entreprises qui voulaient résister à de telles régulations. Et on a prêté trop peu d'attention, malgré des travaux théoriques qui existaient depuis une dizaine d'années, on a prêté trop peu d'attention aussi à l'acceptabilité sociale de ces instruments. Tous les instruments qui vont élever le prix finalement des produits qui sont achetés par les consommateurs et donc diminuer leur pouvoir d'achat, tout cela sont difficiles à faire accepter. C'est-à-dire que si on les interroge, les citoyens vont dire qu'ils sont soucieux du changement climatique et qu'ils voudraient lutter contre le changement climatique. Mais quand on observe les consommateurs, ceux-ci ont d'autres contraintes en particulier et donc résistent à ceci. Donc, c'est la raison, par exemple, pour laquelle quelqu'un comme Stiglitz, dans un article de 2019, a plaidé pour l'utilisation simultanée de toute une batterie d'instruments. C'est-à-dire son message, c'est de faire feu de tout bois. C'est-à-dire, on ne peut pas mettre le niveau de taxe carbone au taux qui serait nécessaire. On ne peut pas, il est difficile de négocier sur les montants de quotas à allouer, de les régler au mieux. Tout ceci, c'est difficile. Eh bien, il faut aussi utiliser d'autres instruments, comme des subventions à la recherche et développement, comme des aides aux consommateurs, comme des soutiens de différentes façons aux énergies renouvelables. Il faut en fait utiliser toute une batterie d'instruments.
And Barbara, you have been in discussion with managers from the financial sector for a long time. Moving forward, what would be your solutions that you would propose to institutional investors and asset managers?
Lots of thoughts, and again, this discussion brings even more really like the approach to give more power to the savers. Philippe's a really interesting one, but I think what I said before, a small strand in the but they are on the move. And I think what we've heard also here from all the panelists is that there is a clear trend in the right direction. But I think it's helpful to understand, why that has happened, and also therefore understand some of the needs in order to really be able to accelerate this transition. So I think what we've seen, again, Philippe referred to green bonds. They have embraced instruments such as green bonds because it takes a known product, a simple product, the bonds that they're familiar with a liquid context, which are capital market, and it also provides a standardized approach to screening and reporting on green, which is based on the green bonds principles, which have really helped in getting these instruments to scale. But again, I think we need to broaden the space, and Philippe said that as well. I think that we need to. The institutional investors have to go beyond green bonds because it's just not going to be enough. And so the how, I think, is really understanding better what their big needs are. But and then in parallel, I think also come from the other side, from the saver side. But I think we always say that ultimately institutional investors and asset managers need the 3S. They need first scale. So there is a need to aggregate smaller scale transactions, project, and really focus on sustainable, resilient infrastructure. Then it's simplicity, again, keeping it simple, using products they're familiar with, or language or assets that they're familiar with. And I think similarly to the green bonds principles, there could be a really interesting opportunity by making sustainable infrastructure as a new preferred asset class. So again, learning the lessons from there, and in this way, getting that to scale. The third is the safety, so really de-risking some of the investments and taking off some of the risks that they aren't able to take on. And I think one of the ways that we have been experimenting with and trying to help with coming up with some of these financial solutions or new products that attract private capital are these types of incubators or accelerators like the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance that we manage, and you refer to that even. Or this lab is this public-private initiative that brings together experts in sustainable investment, both from governments, from development finance institutions, but also from investment banks and institutional investors and other private sector institutions. And again, we have managed to really develop and support new financial solutions that can tackle some of the barriers of institutional investors and attract investment over the last few years. And what we've seen is that many, but not all of the selected ideas employ a blended finance approach, so really leveraging public or concessional finance effectively at the beginning in order to de-risk the earlier stages of development and implementation. And I think that there is a suite of potential instruments. We have developed instruments like bonds, we've had structured equity vehicles, we've had insurance products, guarantees, lending platforms, but also securitization structures. For example, packaging and securitizing the cash flows of renewable energy projects and selling shares into local capital markets, in this way providing long-term finance for projects and thereby becoming attractive to institutional investors. So I think there is a lot of creativity that we need to really use in order to come up with the right products, the right potential investment opportunities. While in parallel, again, I like, as I said, I really like the idea of giving more power to savers, which in my opinion then comes back to the need for better transparency and information again. But let me maybe just end on adding one final S to the 3S that I mentioned before. I think all needs to be done really. We are running out of time, and I think we've just had the 5th anniversary of the Paris Agreement, and I think it's really time to make sure that there is an acceleration of action that really allows us to go towards this carbon neutral future. So, thanks for having me here, and back to you, Iwan.
Thank you. I would like to thank all 3 panelists for this interesting discussion, and I think we not only discussed challenges, but we also put forward some solution for the future. So I would like to thank everyone to be here today for our roundtable. Thank you.